Hello everyone, Nick Mendera here with Emotiva Audio. Today we're going to run through the Dirac room correction process together. To get things going, I'm going to go into a quick overview of what we will be doing here today before we jump directly into the software. Note, if you haven't watched our Dirac interface overview, please click the link up here or down in the video description to watch that video first. Now that we have our Dirac interface kit hooked up and on the network, we can proceed. Our first steps will be connecting our processor microphone to the included A to D digitizer microphone cable via the XLR connection. We want to make sure that the microphone is pointed up towards the ceiling so it picks up not only the speakers but the room as it interacts with the system. Next, we're going to place the microphone in the first measurement position. This first position is the sweet spot of your listening area. The sweet spot will always be ear level at the center seat or listening position, whether you are using a single chair or a sofa. One thing that can easily affect the results you will get during this process is if you are in the picture with the microphone. That means sitting next to the microphone in the seat or holding it in your hand. That will negatively affect your results during the sweep process. We recommend using a microphone stand to make this process easier to capture your measurements. This allows you to get out of the way and let your microphone properly pick up the speakers in your room. We've placed a link in the description below for one that we use ourselves. Next, we will take the USB end of our digitizer cable and plug it into our computer. Do not plug the USB cable into the front of the processor. The software is designed only to run on the home desktop or laptop. If you need a longer extension, feel free to use an extra XLR cable to get the cable distance you need. We've placed a link in the description below for our 2-meter XLR cable. If you need longer than the 2 meters, you can purchase multiple XLR cables and daisy chain them together. Quick note, if you haven't set up your processor, please click the link above or the one in the description below to watch our quick start guide and follow those steps. You will want to make sure that your processor is set to the configuration in your room. Your processor comes with all 16 channels as active, and Dirac will take all those active channels into account. So make sure you turn off any channels that you aren't using. Now that we have our Dirac interface kit up and running and our microphone set, we need to enable Dirac on the processor. You can store up to 3 Dirac equalizations on each of the 2 speaker presets. So for this demo, we're going to enable Dirac on preset 1. I have a black screen right now on my input, and I'm going to bring up the on-screen display by hitting Menu on the remote. Next, we will scroll down to Setup. Click right to go to Speakers, which opens up the full-size OSD. Then we will click right again to preset 1, and then right again to enter the preset 1 speaker menu. From here, we will scroll down to Dirac Live, then scroll right to Enable, then right again to check the box. Click up on the remote to enable Dirac Live. This will now lock you out of the controlling of the processor during the tuning process. Now we will jump over to the computer section of our demo.
After you have enabled Dirac Live in the speaker preset in the menu of your processor, we will open up the Dirac Live software, and it should automatically find any connected and enabled Emotiva processors on your network that have their license activated. We'll select our Emotiva XMC2. If you're using an RMC processor, it would show up as an RMC as the connected device. The next step will be to select our recording device. It's very important that we select the USB audio device, which is the USB digitizer cable that connects to the provided Emotiva measurement microphone. We do not want to select the internal microphone array of your computer, as it will not have enough fidelity to produce a valid direct filter. Now, before moving on, once we've selected the appropriate measurement device, we want to load the Emotiva microphone calibration file by selecting that box and clicking Load from File. And then you'll need to navigate on your computer to the location where you downloaded the Emotiva microphone calibration file from our Dirac Live landing page. So there it is, and I want to open that text file. And you'll see it load in as kind of an adjustment graph below the mic, and once that's been loaded, it should stay with that microphone even the next time you run Dirac. And so once we've selected our recording device, loaded the microphone calibration file, we'll proceed to volume calibration. Before we start doing anything on this screen, I want to make sure that the speakers listed in this section match what is physically connected to my processor. And so I'll scroll all the way to the right and then back to the left and make sure that I don't see any extra phantom channels that are not actually attached to playback test tones for Dirac. If you see additional channels listed in this area that are not actually connected to your processor, you will need to go back and reconfigure your speaker preset, then enable Dirac and start the process again so that your speaker layout in your room matches what's displayed here in the volume calibration menu. So the first step that we'll take for volume calibration is to set the microphone gain. And this is just basically setting the microphone sensitivity for all of your measurements based on the ambient noise level in your room. Notice it defaults to 100%, and as I'm talking, you can see the reading for the microphone bouncing around next to its microphone gain slider. We want this number, when the room is completely quiet and ready to take measurements, to read around -40 dB. And so I'm going to be completely quiet as I can, watch that measurement slider, and then adjust our microphone gain slider to get approximately a -40 dB reading. There, and you could see before I started talking again that we were close enough to -40 dB. And really, plus or minus 3 dB or so will be fine for any of the adjustments that we make on this screen. So anywhere from -37 to -43 dB would have been fine for the microphone gain setting. After we've adjusted our microphone gain, we're not going to touch that slider again, or it may throw off any of the other adjustments that we make on the volume calibration screen in the Dirac software. So we'll leave that slider alone, and the next thing we're going to do is set our master output slider. And this is going to determine the baseline output for all of the speakers that are going to play test tones in your system. And the way that we're going to do this is I'll go ahead and leave the master output down, at one of these lower settings. We don't want it to be too loud initially. And I'm going to select what we call one of our least efficient or our lower output channels before the calibration. Typically, this is something like a surround speaker or even a height speaker. We just don't want to pick one of our main channels like our center or our front so that we have enough adjustability once we start volume calibrating each of our speakers. So in this case, I'm going to pick my left surround. Fairly arbitrary selection here. We just want to pick one of our surrounds or maybe one of our height speakers. And the process for setting this first speaker is I'm going to play the individual test tone for my left surround. So I'm going to do that by pressing this play button here, and you will hear a pink noise test tone come out of your left surround speaker. But I'm not going to touch the individual speaker adjustment slider for the left surround. That will be left up here at the top with the rest of these sliders. I am going to play the test tone for the left surround speaker, but I'm going to adjust its output using the master output slider to set the baseline output for the rest of the speakers in the system. And the number I'm shooting for that will appear as a reading next to the left surround bar once I play the test tone is around -20 dB from the measurement microphone. There. Now you can see that that reading sticks and shows me, I'm at -20.3, which is very, very close to -20. Notice again, for the first speaker, I did not touch its individual speaker slider. I played the test tone for my left surround. I looked at the microphone reading for the test tone on my left surround, but I used the master output slider to adjust where that reading sits really close to -20 dB. Again, anywhere plus or minus 2 or 3 dB away from -20 for any of these measurements will be fine. At this point, we've set our microphone sensitivity, and we're not going to touch that slider again. We've set our master output for the baseline of the system, and ideally, we won't have to touch that master output slider again. So at this point, what I need to do is go back to the beginning of the list of speakers, and I'm going to play test tones from each of the remaining speakers and use their individual speaker sliders to set their output level as close to -20 dB as I can to match that first reading from the left surround. Notice when I tried to set my right rear speaker to the -20 dB level, I actually do not have enough adjustability on the right rear to get close enough to that -20 dB. All that means is that, maybe I should have picked a speaker besides my left surround as my first channel. Well, here's what you can do. I'm simply going to, look at the reading for my right rear, and I will adjust my master output now for my right rear speaker to sit as close to that -20 as possible. Well, notice when I adjusted the master to compensate for the right rear to -20, my left surround reading went up as well to -16.8. Well, that just means it's a slightly stronger output than my right rear, and after the fact, because the software already knows the output level of that speaker, I can go back and use its individual slider to get close enough to the -20 dB reading, right? So I did have to go back and pick another speaker, my right rear, after I chose my left surround at first. But the important thing is that we need to be able to get every speaker close enough, plus or minus a couple dB, to that -20 reading. And so now I'll keep going through the rest of my speakers and see how close I can get to -20. All right, so my right surround, -22.8. It's at the top. I don't have adjustability up close enough to the -20 to where that's not really going to be important. All right, so we've now set all of the relative outputs of all of our channels. We've got all of our dB readings. They're within plus or minus 2 or 3 dB from that -20 mark. You'll notice that on some of the speakers, I didn't take the time to adjust them. They just kind of left them at their default reading at the top if they were close enough to that -20. And for the subwoofer, you'll get more of a pulsing test tone for the sub rather than the pink noise. But at this point, we're ready to proceed to the next step. We have our microphone sensitivity set. We adjusted the master output so that all of our speakers were able to be adjusted to -20. After the first couple speakers, we did have to go make another adjustment to our master output volume, but that's absolutely fine. All of the relative measurements of your sliders will kind of track with that master output so that, and I'll show you, even if you took that after the fact, I could raise that up. Notice they're all going up. Of course, I want them to be back about where they were around -20. So, I'll put that back where it was. All right, and looking at those numbers again, we're close enough. And the purpose of our volume calibration screen here is just to get the relative output of all of your channels that may be powered by different amplifiers or be speakers of different sensitivity, playing at close to the same level of output so that when we run our measurement sweeps, Dirac has a great starting point where all speakers are playing at least close enough to the same level, and we're ready to proceed to select arrangement. Here is where we can select between 3 different options, the default being focused imaging. We can also select tightly focused imaging if you have just one main seating position that you want to focus Dirac on. The focused imaging is a little bit wider. Of course, wide imaging would encompass maybe a larger room that has more spread out seating positions. But the main differentiator between these 3 options is the number of measurement positions that you're taking. The default focused imaging, you'll take 13 measurements positions, tightly focused imaging, 9 measurement positions, and then wide imaging, 17 different measurement positions with your microphone. We typically advise just to stick with the focused imaging, and even once you get into your measurements, you do not have to complete all 13 measurement positions to still get a valid Dirac filter. So we'll just keep it at focused imaging and proceed to measure. And at this point, we're ready to take our first measurement, and we're going to start at the main position. Now, when you kind of hover over these different positions around the seating area, you'll see that when we start taking measurements, it's going to ask you to then move your microphone. We'll talk about moving the mic, but for our first main position, and this is the most critical measurement that Dirac is going to base most of its calculations on, we want the microphone to be at ear level, pointing directly up towards the ceiling at the main seating or listening position. And so we'll start with the main position, and I will click either measured selected position if I want to go ahead and just start measuring right away, or I can also set a timer of up to 15 seconds as a delay before the measurement begins to give yourself time to get out of the room so that your body is not interfering with any of the measurements for the Dirac software. I'm just going to proceed to measure selected position. All right, and so we have completed our first main measuring position, and we can see there's a nice check mark in this box. If we wanted to, we could go back and remeasure the selected position by selecting the main position again, but we got a nice set of measurements from that first sweep, and so we'll move on to our next measurement position, the front top right. And this will require us to move our microphone from the main listening position up and to the front of the main listening position. Now, as a rule of thumb, you can move the microphone to a position that will encompass the entire seating arrangement, or you can just move the microphone around an arm's length away from the main listening position in the indicated direction. It is not highly critical that we move it a specific amount from the main listening position. We just want to move it enough so that Dirac has some additional data that it can gather from our subsequent measurements after the main listening position. So at this point, we'll proceed to measure the front top right, having moved the microphone just a couple of feet up and to the front and right of the main listening position. And we've now completed our second measurement position at the front top right. And of course, you can see the results of those different measurements for each of your different speakers here. And we'll get a more detailed view once we get to the filter design. I'll also point out that you may notice that Dirac runs a sweep on the first speaker it started with at the end of a measurement position, and it does this to compare the original measurement to a measurement at the end of the sweep to make sure that nothing drastic changed in your room or your setup, like the microphone falling over after that first measurement position after that first speaker was measured. So we'll proceed to our third measurement, the front top left, and measure the next position. All right, so at this point, we've taken 3 of our 13 measurement positions. And for sake of time, we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next step, proceed with filter design. And I will note here that you do not have to complete all of the measurements prescribed by the seating arrangement that you chose. However, the more measurement positions you take, the more data the Dirac software will have to produce a good Dirac filter for your listening space. But for now, instead of measuring the next position, we're going to go ahead and proceed to filter design. Again, it's going to ask me, do you want to measure the rest of them? I'll just confirm that I want to proceed with only 3 measurements. Here on the filter design screen, we can see the measured response for each of our individual speakers. And you'll notice that Dirac has automatically created groups for your speakers, right? Group 1, including your side and rear surrounds, Group 2, your fronts, 3, your center, and Group 4, your tops, Group 5, your sub. Of course, you can, if you wanted to group your center with your fronts to make them a group all together. And the purpose of making these groups is that any adjustment you manually apply to, say, your right front speaker, you can also apply that same adjustment to any of the same speakers in that group. But otherwise, there's no need to really pay attention to our groups here. Down here, you can also see some different kind of check boxes here where I want to see not just my measured spectrum, I want to see what the corrected response is going to be after Dirac has done its work. And I can also look at the target curve, which was deactivated in this case. The target curve option is where you can bring up what Dirac is supposedly shooting for, right? This kind of downward sloping flat line here. And I'll also note that that the downward sloping line is slightly downward sloping because in general, we perceive audio to be a little bit more natural, that it kind of rolls down gradually from the lower frequencies down to the upper frequencies, kind of a natural roll off there. On this filter design screen, if this is your first time running Dirac, we often suggest that you leave the target curve alone and also don't try to adjust these curtains, which I'll get to in a second, so you can just experience the basic Dirac curve as it was produced by the software. You can always go back and reopen a saved project, make some edits, and then re-export it to the processor, or of course you can take a completely new set of measurements with a new project. So on the target curve, again, let's say I want to, at a certain frequency up here, I want to apply a boost. I can grab any of these target points and slide them side to side and, produce a little bit of a boost here. And of course, the neighboring points will adjust, how steep or how shallow that curve is. And so you can kind of play with these points and, make manual adjustments to the response. Now, again, we don't want to do anything too extreme, and Dirac kind of has a limit to how steep it can go before it will self-correct. I'll go ahead and try to put this back to as flat as possible. The other adjustment you can make here is with these, what we call curtains. And these limit the frequency range over which Dirac will apply its adjustment for the particular speaker chosen. In this case, I'm adjusting the center. So let's say that I don't want Dirac to adjust in the mid-range or upper frequencies. I want my speaker to just sound however it sounds and not make an adjustment. I only want Dirac to worry about the region of bass management where it's going to cross over with my sub. And so I may, drag this curtain down, and you can kind of see the curve is trying to adjust based on, where I'm headed here. But I can kind of drag this down so that only the portion of the speaker that is going to cross over with the sub is being corrected by Dirac. Anything outside the curtain will not be corrected by Dirac and will just play as the speaker would play with no equalization. But I'll go ahead and bring my curtain back up here to encompass the entire speaker because I want to hear everything that Dirac can do for this speaker. And you'll also notice with your curtains, if I go to my subwoofer, notice the curtains for the sub do not extend all the way out even close to 20 kilohertz. And that's because Dirac has decided the frequency range for each speaker over which it thinks it can perform a correction. And so it notices the sub naturally roll off here, close to 500 hertz. And so it's only going to correct up to around 500 hertz. It's not going to try to make the sub flat all the way out across the audible frequency range because it just wouldn't be able to do that. And it also sees that the sub is sharply rolling off here at around 16 or so hertz. And so it's also decided I'm going to go ahead and stop trying to make an adjustment there at 16 hertz, and then past that just let the sub roll off naturally anywhere below 16 hertz. So after you have made any adjustments to your groups, any manual adjustments to your target curves, change your curtains to encompass the portion of the speaker's frequency range that you want Dirac to adjust, we can proceed to filter export. And because I have not run a Dirac filter and loaded it onto this XMC2, notice I have 3 slots for my speaker preset, and they're all empty. And of course, we could leave it named as empty. I'm going to name it as my speaker configuration 7.1.4 and a date. In that way, this helps me differentiate, what speaker filter this was, by putting a date on it, by putting the speaker configuration. You can also put a description here. This will not show up in the processor menu. The description won't, but the name will. And so, you can name it something like surround or stereo, just depending on your speaker configuration, however you want to name it. But the speaker layout and date is often what we'll do. And so at this point, I'll hit replace existing filter. Of course, it was empty, but we'll just hit replace, and then the processor will receive the export from the software, and once this hits 100%, we should see the filter loaded on the processor. All right, and you should receive this message that we've completed the process and the filter is ready to be used on our XMC2. We can then navigate on the processor back to our speaker preset, and then in the equalization menu of the speaker preset, we should see the name of our Dirac filter as we named it before export, and be able to select that as our active equalization filter on the processor. And at this point, I am ready to close out of my Dirac software. I'm going to go ahead and save my project before I do this. And I'll go ahead and save it as what I did before as my date and speaker configuration. But of course, you can save your project however you want. And I'll just save that to my desktop here. And the reason I'm saving this project is because if later on I want to go back and make any edits to those filters in my filter design, I can then open up the save project without having to take a completely new set of measurements, make any edits to my filters here, and then simply proceed to filter export and re-export my filter. Once we've closed the Dirac Live software, we can go back to our processor menu and use the down arrow to remove the X from the box next to Enable in the speaker preset. At this point, we also want to navigate down to the other option, Shut Down Remote, and use the up arrow to mark this box. This will properly shut down the Dirac Live interface computer that was connected to your network, and that can now be removed from power and disconnected from your network.
And there you have it. Dirac is now set up on your system, and you are ready to start listening. As always, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you so much for your time today, and from all of us at Emotiva, happy listening.